Um, and thank you for coming. I'm excited to talk about my research. As Isabel said, um, this presentation is based on my doctoral dissertation, which I completed last year, and I'm currently working on turning this into an academic book. So I'm very excited to hear your questions or any feedback that you might have. Um, so. My presentation today explores the relationship between nationalism and globalization and how they combined to condition the development of Catalanisme in the post-Franco period. These decades since 1978 saw the collision of two transformative trends that emerged in the late 20th century. The first was a new era of technological, economic, and cultural globalization beginning in the late 70s. And the second was a wave of new and often potent nationalisms emerging in the wake of the Cold War. While the contemporaneous rise of international connection and nationalist divergence may seem paradoxical, these two trends are neither discrete nor are they incidental. Rather, they are both rooted in an understanding of the world as broken up into and then brought together by various nations and their socio-cultural, political, and economic interaction. Increasingly then, in the second half of the 20th century, the nation state was consolidated as the lens through which people made sense of various political projects. As I expect that today's audience is broadly familiar with Catalonia's history, I won't spend too much time up front giving historical background, though I will kind of place us as we go along. What I will say, however, is that while not a nation state, Catalonia is a uniquely fruitful case to study the development of nationalism, the nation state, and globalization. Catalonia exists as something of an exception in an era when the nation state was solidified as the basic unit of international political organization. The region was staunchly in favor of European integration and was deeply rooted in the global processes of the period. However, it is also home to one of the most potent nationalist movements in the West, which rejects the monocultural nationalism of Franco's Spain and makes its case in terms of cultural diversity and mutual respect. I'll suggest today that after Spain's return to democracy, Catalanismo was strengthened by internationalism and processes of globalization. Newfound channels to monetize and export cultural products enabled the spread of Catalan language, history, and culture, and proved crucial to promoting the region as a distinct political entity. So as I take us through all these different channels today, including tourism, elite sport, international higher education, and foreign direct investment, I advance three main arguments. The first is that Catalanismo underwent a global turn during this period. By global turn, I mean that the ideology and actors associated with Catalan nationalism became increasingly aware of and engaged with their global context. This fundamentally redefined the movement's goals, strategies, participants, and audience to be more globally informed and globally oriented. The second argument, and this is perhaps a contentious one, is that contemporary Catalan nationalism is best understood by the ways it responded to the challenges and opportunities of late 20th century globalization. I suggest that globalization is a more useful explanatory device than post-Francoism, secessionism, bourgeois nationalism, leftism, post-colonialism, or any other frames assorted by members of the Academy and the public alike. And third, this research posits that the most salient factors in the development and popularization of Catalanismo were not the agency of actors one would necessarily associate with a nationalist movement, but rather the wider political, social, and cultural context that they acted within. Accordingly, the primary object of study here is not activist political groups or politicians, but rather the forces that affected them. This is an important contribution in the broader literature for a variety of reasons. Most immediately, that there is a contemporary and real-world necessity to understand the dynamics at play, not just in Catalonia, but abroad, but further afield as well. Nationalism is undeniably a potent force in contemporary politics, while globalization is the dominant international paradigm of the 21st century. They dominate our world and set the socio-political agenda for the next several decades. Both of these are evolving phenomena in their own right, as well as in their relationship to one another. Simply put, we cannot understand contemporary nationalism without accounting for the effects of globalization and vice versa. Broadly speaking, my work shows how nationalism globalized, and importantly, how globalization provides fertile ground for national projects. This research then is opposed to the persistent idea in academia and in public discourse that the relationship is one of polar opposition or reaction. Rather, both nationalism and globalization flow into one another, making possible and conditioning their continued development. So the first collision between nationalism and globalization that I'll explore today is tourism. Tourism and its political implications have a long history in Catalonia. However, there have been substantial changes to the region's tourism industry in the post-Franco period, with some very surprising consequences. Given its historic popularity as a tourism destination, I explore the shift specifically along the Costa Brava and in the province of Girona. In the 50s and 60s, the Franco regime used mass tourism not only as a way to open itself up to a skeptical international community, but also to paint Spain as culturally and politically homogenous. Here we see some images of Costa Brava resorts as they were portrayed in British holiday catalogs in the early 1970s. So what do we see? We don't see food, no culture. We just see beaches and hotels. Really, these images could be from anywhere in the world. No matter which of these resorts holidaymakers chose to visit, they could enjoy some of the hallmarks of Spanish mass tourism, including a Sol y Sombra cocktail. They could take in a bullfight at the local bull ring or head downtown for a flamenco show and steins of beer at the local German beer house. These attractions, of course, have nothing to do with Catalonia. That's because under Franco, attractions were defined in both cultural content and political function by the centralism of the regime. Explicitly nationalist by design, the region's attractions promoted narratives of Spain's homogeneity and national harmony. By the late 1990s, visitors to the Costa Brava would not find bullfights or flamenco, and importantly, they would not be seeking them. Soon, Franco's narratives had lost their hold as well. Forget what you thought you knew about Spain, commands the Thomas Cook Traveler's Catalonia Guidebook from 2005. This is Catalonia, a land whose rich history and culture are distinctly different from those in the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. Once an independent kingdom, in many ways, Catalonia still feels like a land apart. This new narrative, which flips Francoist claims on their head, was the product of various domestic and global developments. As much as this excerpt from a Thomas Cook guidebook would not have made any sense to visitors in the 60s or 70s, we might expect a similarly overt, if opposing, political Catalan nationalism to be the root of such a separatist narrative. The reality, however, is far more complex. So what I found in looking further into this is that there were two primary causes for this drastic narrative shift. The first was domestic in nature, namely the death of Franco in 1975 and Spain's subsequent transition to democracy and devolution of powers. On issues of tourism, future PSC member and Spanish Minister of Industry and Energy, Joan Mayo, represented the Generalitat, and former Falangist politician Eduardo del Rio Iglesia represented the Spanish Secretary of State for Tourism. Over a series of meetings in March and April of 1978, these two developed a strong working relationship. One issue, though, however, continued to flare up, and this was that issue was who would retain the power of international tourism promotion. Mayo was so insistent that the power be given to the Generalitat that he recommended to his superiors that they postpone all transfer of powers related to tourism until this issue was resolved. The question is then, why was this such a sticking point? A cynical interpretation is that both wanted power over international promotion in order to bolster their side's national interests at the expense of the other. However, there is little to support this theory. Both Spain and Catalonia benefited from a strong tourism industry in the region, no matter which body carried out its promotion. Rather, in correspondence relating to negotiations both between one another and with their bosses, it became clear that they were simply acting out of an economic common sense. That is, each simply thought that the institution they represented was better suited to promote regional tourism and generate business. Soon, this issue of international promotion would cease to be an important issue anyway. The newly formed tourism board in the province of Girona soon realized that it was far more important to diversify the region's attractions than to promote these package tours. The popularity of the Costa Brava's resorts were well established, but other tourism products, such as ones relating to sport, culture, and cuisine, had not received as much attention and were less developed. They were less popular and they were less profitable. Simply put, money was being left on the table. The second cause for the broad narrative shift was more global in nature. And this is what scholars refer to as a shift to a post-Fordist model of tourism. This new model captured a move away from large-scale mass tourism that we might recognize under Franco to a more segmented, diversified tourism experience. New attractions were more focused on unique environments, cultures, societies, and geographies. And this took place in an evolving industry that welcomed new technologies around the same time. So in the 90s and 2000s, platforms emerged such as Booking.com, which was created in 1996, Expedia, also 96, and Airbnb in 2008. These allowed customers direct means of booking accommodations, as well as making accessible new parts of the destinations they visited. It was easier to find out information. They didn't just have to sign on to a bus tour or go to an all-inclusive resort. They could become more engaged with the local environment. Websites like TripAdvisor, which was created in 2000, and a wave of online travel blogs also emerged into the 2000s, served as decentralized sources of information about destinations and attractions. Another very important actor in the history of Costa Brava tourism is Ryanair. Ryanair's decision to make Girona's airport its hub for Barcelona and the Costa Brava supercharged tourism to the region. The resulting tenfold increase in passengers brought millions of new visitors to the province of Girona in the 90s and 2000s, levels which remained higher than before, even after Ryanair moved its operations to El Prat in 2008. As tourism boomed during this period, regional authorities welcomed and fostered increased traffic from countries across Europe, North America, South America, and Asia. These new visitors wanted authentic cultural experiences, not walled beach resorts. And if these tourists increasingly demanded authenticity, it was local authorities and businesses that produced the content of that authenticity. What follows is what I call here the Catalanization of the Costa Brava. It was essentially the creation of a new image for the Costa Brava. In this post-Fordist era, Girona's officials became aware that they were no longer promoting a holiday package, but rather a destination. And the board then employed three strategies to meet this new demand. The first was a reclamation of cultural practice from Spain. This meant not only getting rid of the bull rings and the flamenco, but also creating a Catalan image or a brand with which the region's attractions could be associated. The second then was to increase awareness of the hallmarks of Catalan culture. The board used tourism publications and international publicity to promote Catalan language traditions such as the sardana and castellers, in addition to specifically Catalan cuisine. The third strategy, and we can see some of these here, was the creation of new cultural traditions and attractions. So one of the examples of this is the Costa Brava Centenari celebration put on by the board from 2008 to 2010, and the Fira de Indians, which was celebrated for the first time in 2004 and every year since. Further inland, similar projects in the city of Girona and the Pyrenees include the restoration of El Calhueo and the creation of several new museums in the Old Town, as well as new efforts to stimulate hiking, skiing, and other active tourism in the Pyrenees. These changes were amplified in media to great effect. Readers of Thomas Cook brochures in the 70s and 80s might see only 2 lines about Catalan destinations, and even these were likely to be referred to as Spanish. In the early 2000s, however, they began publishing in-depth guidebooks for huge amounts of destinations. In a series of Catalonia-specific guidebooks from this period, tourists learned that, quote, Catalonia, though part of the modern Spanish state, was historically a separate country and has now regained much of its autonomy after centuries of repression. This guidebook that we're looking at here, obviously we can see some hallmarks of Catalan culture. It's 300 pages long, this book, and it was published, there were 3 editions of it between 2000 and 2009. It has language lessons, history lessons, information about local politics, cuisine, traditions, just about everything. This new accessibility of information and the new narratives, by definition, changed how people came to think about Catalonia and its territories. For example, looking at TripAdvisor, we can see the ways that these new encounters helped cultivate an image and understanding of the region, its history and culture that could not have been possible in the 1970s. Crucially, and this is the important point here, the promotion of hyperlocal culture and these narratives that differentiate Catalonia from the rest of Spain reached international populations, but they did not require explicit political nationalism. Rather, in a global tourism market, presenting as unique an identity as possible and proclaiming its authenticity was simply a good marketing strategy. In this way, international tourism applied a market logic that draws boundaries around peoples, places, and cultures, creating discrete entities in competition with one another. If tourism was a mechanism of national spread in the latter half of the 20th century, language is a much older feature of European national identity. This, as you all well know, is certainly true of Catalanisme. The Catalan language has been a focal point for centuries. And though expressions of Catalan linguistic nationalism have shifted over the past 2 centuries, often in line with predominant international paradigms. Catalan's development in the modern era can be traced to a mid-19th century Renaissance that aimed to recover the Catalan language lost to Castilian domination during preceding centuries. This period, spanning from the 1830s to about the 1880s, kickstarted a process of linguistic standardization that Catalan had not previously experienced. The participating writers and linguists were quite self-aware about the Renaissance's ability to create a national identity centered on a unifying language. Many accounts of the Renaissance usually begin with Bonaventura Carles Aribao's 1833 poem Ode a la Patria. Over the following decades, Catalans used the written work to imagine the Catalan nation both geographically and spiritually. These writers, poets, and politicians were in frequent contact with one another and formed a recognizable network of linguistic activists. Many prominent Catalan linguists studied abroad, particularly in Germany, before returning to Catalonia to deploy their new scientific understandings of Catalan in the realm of politics. These efforts yielded events such as the First International Congress of the Catalan Language, held in Barcelona in 1906, and institutions such as the Institut d'Estudis Catalans, which was founded the following year. This newly rich environment of Catalan linguistics helped nurture the early career of many linguists, including Pompeu Fabra, who published texts on Catalan grammar, vocabulary, and other foundational resources. These texts helped popularize Catalan as a flexible and modern national language. Absent a central government, however, these efforts were often under threat and relied on a sparse network of academics for their survival. Under the dictatorships of Primo de Rivera and Franco, exiles came to play an increasingly important role in continuing the practice of academic work on Catalan. This increasingly took place in foreign institutions. One result of this trend is the creation of the Anglo-Catalan Society, or the ACS. The ACS is a professional organization based in the UK. In 1948, the exiled Josep Maria Batista i Roca arrived at Cambridge and began teaching courses on Catalan language and culture. Other Catalan exiles, such as Joan Guilí, embedded themselves at Oxford around the same time. Slowly, these academics grew a network of both Catalan linguistic and cultural studies within the British Academy. By 1954, the small collection of Catalan students and faculty in the UK formed the ACS. The following decade saw the publication of English language guides to Catalan, which led the way for future generations of students to nurture their interest in the language, even if they had no personal connection to the region. As Franco's linguistic repression became more relaxed in the latter years of his dictatorship, new organizations such as Òmnium Cultural promoted the popular use of Catalan both at home and abroad. Organizations similar to the ACS were founded in North America, Italy, and Germany in the 70s and 80s, with even more international groups to follow in the 90s and 2000s. These organizations, alongside ad hoc academic networks, helped sustain the language's development during the mid-20th century. The end of the Franco regime and Spain's subsequent return to democracy in the late 70s coincided with increased institutional interconnectedness across Europe. Many predicted that the European Community, or later the EU, would supplant European nation-state sovereignty entirely. In this context of political uncertainty, many Catalans harbored great hopes that further integration would provide increased opportunities to exercise regional autonomy. Geographer Joan Becut certainly felt this way. In a June 1998 issue of Avui, he wrote that the EU's Erasmus program was, quote, a historic opportunity to promote Catalan with the help of the EU and without the interference of the Spanish state. In his conception, Europe was a tool that, if used correctly, could promote Catalonia to the world. Indeed, as he wrote, quote, "Catalonia does not have a state, but it has opportunities in Europe." Other linguistic activists tended to agree. And during the 1980s and 90s, linguists began to embed themselves and their language in European educational frameworks, such as Erasmus and the Association for Language Teachers in Europe. In fact, the very first ALTA conference was held in Barcelona. Other programs more pointed towards industry, such as the Pointer program, were also a focus, and linguists frequently attended language expos across the EU. At this time, efforts by the Generalitat to promote Catalan language education abroad were relatively modest. They did, however, support a small number of Catalan lectors to teach the language at foreign universities. These young teachers, at the time often graduate students, added to a sparse group of academics that continued to rely on individual effort and personal networks. By the end of the 1990s, however, hopes that the EU would deliver Catalonia from Spanish centralism were largely unrealized. Thus, the regional government and activists shifted their international focus from European programs to forming direct partnerships between Catalan entities and foreign entities. These efforts relied not on European institutions themselves, but rather on the universal values of global culture that they represented or promoted. The Institut Ramon Llull is a paradigmatic example of this strategy. Founded in 2002, it was explicitly modeled on other European cultural institutes, such as the British Council or the Goethe Institute. Such institutions relied on the ideological foundation of cosmopolitan universalism, which understands world cultures not only as discrete, but valuable in their own right. And the IRL was no different. It performs myriad functions, but in the realm of language education, the Institute's primary efforts surrounded the Xarxa Llull. With the Xarxa Llull, the small network of lectors sponsored by the regional government in the late 80s and early 90s was systematically expanded. The network slowly grew during the early 2000s, with the IRL signing agreements with hundreds of universities around the world and funding lector postings, mostly concentrated in Europe and North America, but reaching as far as South America, Asia, and Africa. Funding for these positions was never abundant, and particularly after 2008, the IRL had to be strategic. Even at its peak, the various initiatives never taught more than 10 to 20,000 students per year. But the goal was never to make Catalan a hegemonic language in the world. Rather, these efforts were designed to insert the language into the web of international cooperation. This dynamic is summed up nicely by Josep Anton Fernandez, the IRL's head of Language and Universities Department. In an interview that I conducted with him, he told me that, quote, "Since Catalan is not a global language like English, French, or Spanish, the policies of the IRL do not aim at achieving a very large number of universities, but instead aim to be present in the best universities of each country." In a report published on the IRL's 10th anniversary, Director Vicente Villatoro wrote that, quote, "Each culture must establish a strategy of projection according to their possibilities and needs." Higher education was a channel through which the IRL could promote Catalan, and it is one that would be important for the language's development and its global presence. This was important because, as Villatoro suggests, contemporary culture cannot be without being in the world. For the IRL, the benefit of Catalan's presence in international universities was not that it would create an army of nationalists out of foreign students, but rather that its presence in foreign curricula was itself a victory. The presence of Catalan in foreign universities was designed to soothe the fear of linguistic atrophy at home and strengthen national identity. After all, if scholars at Harvard, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne deem Catalan worth studying, then speakers in the region could take pride in its use and devote effort and resources towards its preservation. At least this was the reasoning taken on by the IRL during this period. This strategy reveals a consciousness of universities' role as sites of epistemological production. Somewhat unexpectedly then, the cultural cosmopolitanism on which these institutions rest provided the perfect environment for the popularization of a nationalist epistemology. Catalonia's economic elite and their commercial interests have also been intimately bound up in the national question since at least the mid-19th century. However, as the region's socioeconomic landscape changed in the post-Franco period, so too did the influential actors in Catalonia's nationalist coalition. Globalization brought about a fundamental change in this relationship as nationalist actors married traditional cultural nationalism with an economic nationalism rooted in a globalizing economy. Both Spain and Catalonia experienced significant social and political upheaval throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The regional bourgeoisie, however, largely remained a constant in that they dominated Catalan society and played an outsized role in negotiating the region's political fortunes. Catalonia developed industrialized manufacturing much earlier than other parts of Spain, with factory-based production driving economic growth and urbanization as early as the 1830s. This long history of economic strength helped create a regional bourgeoisie built largely on the back of wealthy families, such as the Güells, the Arañós, the Villavecchias, or the Girona family. Elite families like these were heavily involved in the social institutions of Catalonia. This took many forms, such as owning a box at the Gran Teatre del Liceu or taking leadership positions in the planning of the Jocs Florals. Politically, this period also brought widespread bourgeois support for the Liga Regionalista and the creation of the Mancomunitat. Generally speaking, the elite were most involved in and vocally supportive of Catalanisme when it suited them, but also disavowed it when it didn't. Indeed, elite support from figures like these for nationalist institutions dwindled when their personal economic interests diverged. The Catalan bourgeoisie was largely delighted with Primo de Rivera's crushing of the labor movement in the region and his overthrow of the liberal government in Madrid. Once Franco's forces won the civil war, his regime crushed both Catalanisme and the labor movement in the region. The Catalan bourgeoisie lined up behind Franco not so much in spite of the former, but in support of the latter. Indeed, wealthy families became more concerned with making sure that their children mastered foreign languages before Catalan, a language that under Franco was identified with leftist reactionism. The second half of the 20th century, however, saw a shift in the regional economy. Manufacturing gave way to tourism and services as the primary industry in the region. The traditional family firms that were so important in the industrial sector gradually lost their economic position. This was only part of a wider shift in economic models that brought in new types of industry and indeed multinational companies. By 1991, services outweighed industries in the Barcelona metropolitan area by 59% to 33% and continued to grow quickly. Just 5 years later, the gap would grow to 63% to 31%. Along with these shifting industries, a new socioeconomic group would take up the mantle as the most influential in their relationship to nationalism. The middle-class base targeted by Jordi Pujol in his 23 years of regional leadership was bound up in globalization in a way that 19th and 20th century bourgeoisie was not. These voters were often employed by multinational companies, came into contact with foreign nationals as co-workers, friends, and through various media, and simultaneously experienced the freedom to participate in Catalan culture in an era of democracy. Pujol spoke to many audiences by combining radical Catalanist rhetoric with pragmatic economic practice. Regional policy followed in this vein. The Barcelona model, an urban regeneration project carried out by the regional and city governments in the 80s and 90s, was a clear distillation of this philosophy. A shift towards public-private collaboration, the use of cultural industries as drivers of the regional economy, and an increased focus on regional competitiveness would all characterize Catalonia's economic development around the turn of the 21st century. Even after Pujol left office, the goals of regional rejuvenation and integrating Catalonia into a global market remained key for regional governments. Increasingly, business and economic development were viewed as means to accomplish both goals. One of the new institutions that emerged in the mid-2000s was the Fundació de Empresaris de Catalunya, or FEMCAT. Founded in 2005, FEMCAT's manifesto explains the organization's mission to bring, quote, together a number of business people, executives, and professionals who want to see a greater level of development for Catalonia, both with regard to businesses and the social fabric that makes them possible. Even further back, dating back to its foundation in 1982, the Patronat Català Pro Europa was a public-private organization that aimed to help regional actors prepare for Spain's entry into the European community. By 2012, the PCPE was rebranded to Diplocat. Diplocat was no longer responsible for providing courses on integration and resources for education, but was rather charged with designing and carrying out various types of public diplomacy with an aim to, quote, explain Catalonia to the world, and influence international public opinion in order to improve the image and prestige of the country abroad, while creating bonds and relationships of trust between the citizens and institutions of Catalonia and those other countries. Both of these institutions then played a large role in what scholars call nation branding. This term, nation branding, refers to both a diplomatic practice as well as a literal consulting industry that has emerged in the last 2 decades. It's also a useful heuristic for understanding how international publics encounter and understand peoples and places. In recent decades, public institutions endeavored to brand Catalonia, making it recognizable and promotable to the world. These efforts boosted recognition of Catalonia as a unique territorial and political entity, all while promoting economic development as a lens through which solutions to domestic problems could be solved. If during this period then Catalonia became a brand, national symbols were similarly transformed. FC Barcelona, long considered a national symbol in Catalonia, undertook a dual mission to globalize and renationalize in the post-Franco era. It was by globalizing in a certain manner that the club retained its national significance, and only by retaining this national significance could the club effectively globalize. In the 21st century, club executives consciously endeavored to turn Barça from Mascon Club to Mascon Club en el Món. This growth, however, was not always linear. There was much to learn from instances of false starts and failures that were part of their globalizing process. One of the oldest institutions at FC Barcelona, which helps paint a clear picture of this dynamic, are the Peñas. First started in the early decades of the 20th century, by the 1980s, club leadership spoke glowingly about the Peñas as a sign of the club's vitality. Efforts to globalize the club by creating new Peñas, however, did not bring the club much money, even if they created dozens, if not hundreds, of these clubs across the world. Similar efforts to expand the number of socies offered more promise. It's hard to overstate how important the socies are, or the club members are to the club. Everybody related to the club spoke about them as the essence, the very essence of the club. More than just the club being member owned, club dues, or dues paid by club members, were the largest single income stream for the club. Under the first period of Joan Laporta's presidency in the mid-2000s, membership grew to over 200,000 individuals worldwide, with the goal to increase that number every single year. His successor, Sandro Rosell, however, put a stop to what he called the Million Socies campaign, reportedly because he was worried about the possibility of international members electing a club president from China. The club also tried to integrate international sports in addition to international fans. Here we see an exhibition game between Pau Gasol's FC Barcelona and his former team, the LA Lakers. Another particularly glaring example of this strategy is Joan Gaspart's failed partnership with the US National Football League. Dating back to 1989, the NFL had run an American Football League across Europe in one form or another. In 2002, amidst declining attendance, the NFL signed a mutual promotion agreement with FC Barcelona. As part of this deal, NFL Europe's Barcelona Dragons rebranded, and they became the FC Barcelona Dragons. In return, the NFL would promote FC Barcelona in the United States. Though the impulse to partner with the massively profitable NFL to make inroads in the American market might have been a good one, the FC Barcelona Dragons collapsed after only 2 seasons. NFL Europe befell a similar fate just a few years later. FC Barcelona did, however, find a way to expand the club's social and economic base internationally while maintaining its regional identity. It did so by engaging foreign publics as customers and consumers. In doing so, leaders promoted FC Barcelona as a sporting commodity and cultural ambassador in a global market. They did so by focusing on their most popular and characteristic product, which is first-team men's football, whose success on the pitch allowed the club to monetize and export its cultural and national identity. Where sporting and membership expansion failed, a model of media, marketing, and merchandising allowed for Barca's rapid expansion into foreign markets. This effort capitalized on a revolution in global media technology and use. Broadcast revenue during this period, particularly from international television rights, produced stunning economic acceleration. Audiovisual rights became increasingly important during the 2000s, not only becoming the club's primary source of income, but later dwarfing soci dues and ticket sales. From 2001 to 2009, income from foreign membership and ticket sales increased by 56%. However, this represented just 13% of the total budget. That proportion was down from over 50% 20 years earlier. At the same time, broadcast-driven revenue was skyrocketing, seeing a 271% increase in annual income, growing from 23% of total revenue in 2001 to 35% in 2009. Billions of euros poured into the club, not just from TV rights, but also from advertising and sponsorship deals. As the first lucrative deals paid incredible dividends in the 2000s, more agreements were signed every year. In a pleasing illustration of Barca's local and global significance, they signed sponsorship deals with Estrella Damm and international giant Coca-Cola in 2002. La Caixa came on board as an official patron the following year. Kellogg's and Vueling became club sponsors during the 05-06 season, with Apple and Gillette following their lead the year after. We see here a sponsor map from 2014 and 2015. By this year, Barcelona had signed agreements for official sponsors for tires in Turkey, telecommunications in Indonesia, fitness clubs in Saudi Arabia, and air fresheners in Brazil. Here we see total club income, which skyrockets in the 2000s. This is due to a combination of factors above, as well as a surge in player transfer fees. These two were driven up by the newfound marketability of star players and the ballooning dividends paid for TV rights in top competitions. All of a sudden, the stakes were much higher. The commercialization of the club's international fan base was only part of Barca's global development. At the same time, the club were expanding their media presence, signing sponsorship deals and selling merchandise all over the world. FC Barcelona were conscious to expand their social and humanitarian enterprises as well through the creation of the Fundació Barça. Originally created in 1994 as a way to avoid making FC Barcelona a public company, the Fundació originally focused on local causes before taking a global turn of its own. In the early 2000s, it began working with the Red Cross, UNICEF, the Special Olympics, and countless other global organizations. If Barca's commercial endeavors allowed the club to create a presence in wealthy countries of the global north, their humanitarian efforts during this period allowed them to create a connection with poorer countries of the global south. It had the added benefit of stimulating a narrative of FC Barcelona and Catalonia more generally as responsible social and political actors. Moreover, it exported the club's stated values of civility, Catalanisme, and universality, as it expanded from a mechanism of club governance and local philanthropy to a major player in global humanitarianism. Simply put, the Fundació's reputation building and value exporting played a crucial role in making Barça más que un club en el món. In promoting cosmopolitanism and Catalanisme, the Fundació's actions helped benefit the region of Catalonia itself. In one sense, this is another case of nation branding. The club simply represented the region in a positive light. However, the club and its constituent arms also used their influence to promote Catalan language, history, and culture through their museum, sponsors, and merchandise. When they signed their agreement with Spotify to sponsor the Camp Nou, part of that contract was that the Spotify app had to be made available in Catalan. The FC Barcelona Museum, which opened in the 1980s, is routinely one of the most visited museums in all of Spain and talks a lot about the history of Catalonia and Francoist repression. And then, of course, we have the ever-popular Senyera kit, which is often Barca's third kit, which is bought and proudly worn by fans all over the world. More than any of this, though, the Fundació offered Catalonia the opportunity to mimic state capacities. The Fundació's humanitarianism presented opportunities to advance strategic regional interests and gave regional leaders a direct connection to international organizations like the UN and the EU. One can hardly differentiate between this strategy with actions that many commentators today define as sports washing. There was rightful outrage surrounding campaigns undertaken by states with controversial environmental or human rights records, such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia. In these cases, fans of Formula One, professional golf, or Newcastle United FC in the UK were inadvertently turned into supporters of less than reputable national projects, to put it lightly. The involvement of these actors in international networks simultaneously brought economic gain, international familiarity, and in many senses, legitimacy. The logic and function behind FC Barcelona's efforts during this period, and this is the point I want to make, are the same. The difference, of course, is that FC Barcelona relied on a politically redemptive past and continued humanitarian efforts to maintain a moral and social legitimacy that these other countries and other projects couldn't. The important takeaway is that this process allowed Catalonia a prominent position in a global commercial system that it did not previously enjoy. Such a position was made possible by the reconfiguration of a relationship between club and supporter and state and citizen as one between brand and consumer. If, during this period, Catalonia became a brand, I argue that FC Barcelona became an important brand ambassador. Barca's brand ambassadorship and efforts at sports washing, then, are merely two sides of the same coin. And finally, some conclusions. In the lead up to 2017, we see yet another global turn, and this is global protest. I argue that this came about largely because other routes towards national liberation had failed, and because globalization had thus far generally aided the cause of Catalanisme. ETA and Basque nationalism had exposed the limits of armed resistance to the Spanish state in the 1950s, while Catalans also lost faith in the EU's legislative power as a liberatory mechanism towards the end of the 20th century. In the early 2000s, Pujol left office, leaving a vacuum in the wake of 23 years of neoliberal Catalanisme. At the same time, Spain's political landscape turned decidedly to the right. The challenges to the 2006 Statute of Autonomy, alongside the 2008 financial crash and the 2011 Eurozone crisis, made many Catalans feel that they could trust Spain's institutions even less than they thought. Not only would the Constitutional Tribunal not grant them increased autonomy, but the region was tied to a failing Spanish economy. If armed struggle would not bear fruit, the EU would not bring about the dissolution of the nation state, and Spain would not abide increased autonomy. Activists had to look elsewhere. After 2008, in a decade when mass protests swept the world, globalizing national struggles seemed to be working in South America, the Middle East, and beyond. At the same time, regional activists could look at the globalizing processes of tourism, FC Barcelona, language, education, and more, and feel confident that globalization had helped strengthen and spread their cause. Globalizing their nationalism, then, seemed like the movement's best hope. In the lead up to 2017, this is exactly what activist groups did. What followed was a new focus on social media, use of English and other foreign languages to reach international audiences, and indeed trying to capture the attention of those international audiences. Moreover, activists imported tactics and rhetorical frames from other protest groups across the world. Many have posited that 2017 was the final burst of anger from a generation that had lived through Francoist repression. Others claim, who are more skeptical, that independence sentiment was merely the lashing out of regional elite who wanted to lighten their tax bill. Another popular narrative presents the turn towards independence as the natural culmination of a unique people asserting their political will of sovereign representation. Each of these accounts capture real and important dynamics of 21st century Catalanisme, but they also gloss over the complex interaction between various groups and forces that ultimately culminated in the 2017 referendum. The events leading up to the referendum were complex and conditioned by regional, national, and global trends. But was this focus on independence inevitable? As frustrations in the region built in the 21st century, there were several ways in which political and civil groups could have harnessed this energy. Independent statehood was perhaps the most obvious. The nation-state was and is the fundamental unit of international political organization. Thus, when Catalans felt like one was failing, Spain, perhaps another, Catalonia, could better represent their interests. Independent statehood was also the most controversial option, and thus became a useful wedge issue for both supporters and opponents of the proposal. The prospect of independence not only garnered substantial attention from domestic and international media and political actors, but this attention drove support for the movement. Thus, a combination of optimism among regional political actors and sizable political will amongst Catalan voters took the shape of the nearest available model, independence. 2017 was a failure, but it was not the end of Catalanisme. If 2017 was not the end of Catalan nationalism, perhaps it was the end of its global turn. In recent years, the movement has turned inwards in regard to the issues on which it focuses, its disposition towards international developments, as well as its efficacy. 2017, then, is another data point that helps us to understand Catalanisme's continued evolution. The various global turns that I've traced today show how globalizing forces have fundamentally impacted international and domestic political organization. More than just demanding a policy response from politicians and governments across the world, new technologies, economic entanglements, increased communication, and the institutions designed to wrangle these developments have altered the environment in which political engagement takes place. In this environment, new actors, new ideas, new terms of engagement, and new forms of political power have emerged. In each of these ways, globalization presents a challenge to political community and representation. As such, global processes are inextricable from the personal nature of identity. This current period of renationalization that we're living through is not without historical precedent. The modern nation state was born in the 18th and 19th century. The first half of the 20th century saw the demise of empires and the establishment of new political units. The second half of the 20th century is largely a story of their afterlives. Now, in a period of profound global reorganization, the state and the nation will once again have to find their place. The commonly accepted framework for organization during these earlier periods was democracy. This is true, even if that framework was challenged and expressed in different ways. Democracy is once again being challenged in both of its root senses. Who are the demos, and what will their kratos look like? The wave of nationalist politics in the 21st century is then part of this process at rearticulating the state's role. In each of these previous periods, the shape, character, and function of the state was up for contestation. This is true once again. It is then incumbent upon political actors of all stripes to help shape the state of the future in their desired image. Thank you very much.